Yo, what it do, brothers? You are now tuned in to all that R.A.R.A with your Hebrew brother Milo Judah. What's going on, man? So, brothers, there has been an article that has came out maybe about a week and a half ago or so, and I saw the article when it dropped, but obviously, I have a life to live. I have things to do. But anyway, I wanted to cover it because when I saw the article come out, I found it pretty funny. I found it highly amusing because if you are a fan of boxing, then you will understand that for the longest, Errol Spence wanted to fight the champions at the welterweight division, and he was avoided for a while, right? Specifically by Keith, one-time Thurman, right? So the article came out from the website secondsout.com, and it reads, former world champion calls out Errol Spence after years of waiting to fight. Send a contract. All right, so Errol Spence is being targeted for a showdown by a former world champion. Spence is yet to make his return to the ring following the defeat he suffered to countryman Terrence Crawford back in July of 2023. And yes, Errol was stopped in the 9th round of that mega fight between him and one Terrence Bud Crawford. And, Errol didn't necessarily look like himself in that fight. Who knows what the case may have been. I mean, watching the pre-fight, when you watched Errol in his pre-fight interview, Errol looked high as hell. But either way, he went out there that night. He got into the ring. He fought Terrence Bud Crawford, and he took an L. And he did look pretty bad, right? He looked slow, like his feet was in mud. He looked like he had no power on his shots. And my coach, Nate Campbell, he pretty much said that he believed that Errol Spence Jr. was weight drained. And I believe that as well, but I also believe that, there were some other things going on with Errol Spence, right? As far as him having the rib injury, as far as him not being able to spar, because it seemed as if his timing was off. The same way his timing was off in the beginning of that Yordenis Ugas fight, right? But the thing about Yordenis Ugas and Terrence Crawford is that Terrence Crawford has the power and the ability to open up that soft tissue that Errol Spence has from, his eye surgeries or whatever the case may be. Or Terrence Crawford has the power to take full advantage of Errol Spence's mistakes. And Errol does make mistakes, right? He does have the habit of getting off balance, especially post-car accident, right? When you watch his fights, pre-car accident, he wasn't really getting off balance like after he would throw a hook and miss, What I do realize is that Errol, he started to create a lot of bad habits after that Sean Porter fight. But the Sean Porter fight was the fight right before his accident, right? So, it is what it is. But either way, let's continue to read. So it says the 35-year-old from Long Island, New York, was the throne of his unified WBC, WBA, and IBF World Welterweight titles that night. Stopped in the 9th round of the historic showdown with Crawford, which saw a dominant Bud become the first ever undisputed champion at 147 pounds within the 4-belt era. And yes, Bud did look magnificent that night. You can say what you want to say about Errol Spence. He may have been compromised, but that's not Terrence Crawford's fault, right? And there has been a push trying to say that Terrence Crawford may have been and may be on some type of performance enhancement drugs. I'm not necessarily going to get into that. I don't know. I'm not there with him. I'm not going to speculate. But that fight against Errol Spence was the best that he ever looked. That is true. And he didn't look like a superhuman against Israel Madrimov. That is true as well. But either way, Errol Spence may have just been food for Terrence Crawford. You never know, right? So it says it had been speculated that Spence would make his long-awaited return to the ring earlier this year, but a touted bout against WBC super welterweight world champion Sebastian Fundora did not materialize. I'd say that's an extremely dangerous fight for Errol Spence based off Sebastian Findora's height. And the way that Sebastian Findora was using his reach against Tim Tszyu in their second fight, the way he was using his jab, the way he was coming behind his jab and using his right hand, he looked pretty great. Now, Tim Tszyu was able to get his head off the line and catch Findora a few times. I think he made his nose bleed again, if I remember correctly, in that second fight. But one thing about Errol Spence is he is not the best at moving his head right now. What I will say is that may be a product of Derrick James, because when you watch Alicia Baumgartner's last fight, she wasn't moving her head that much. And Alicia Baumgartner is one who usually has pretty decent head movement. So for her to not be moving her head like that in her last fight, that kind of says more to me about Derrick James and, him teaching his fighters to get their head off the line. But whatever the case is, you don't really see that too much from Errol Spence. So, that would make Sebastian Findora an extremely tough fight for Errol. Right? But if Errol could come back and look like his self prior to the car accident, or even just be able to have, a good amount of punch resistance, because being weight drained, being dehydrated, that does have a significant amount of effect on your punch resistance. And we saw that Errol couldn't even take a jab from Terrence Crawford. Man, boy was punching the shit out of Errol. All right, but it says, in an interview with Fight Hub TV, two-time world champion Keith Thurman revealed he would be interested in a fight with Spence. Now, for people who have been following Errol Spence for, the past few years, specifically prior to that 2019 accident, you know that Errol Spence was chasing a fight with Keith Thurman. And Keith Thurman would not fight Errol Spence. And it got to the point where Errol Spence said he would not fight Keith Thurman anymore. I believe Keith Thurman was a mandatory for Errol Spence, and Errol Spence would not fight him. Because Errol chased Keith Thurman for years when Keith Thurman was the guy, and Keith Thurman would not fight him. Right, but now that Errol looked compromised in that fight with Terrence Bud Crawford, he looked slow. He looked like he couldn't take a punch. He looked like he had no power, no pop on his punches. Now, it's pretty ironic that Keith Thurman would want to call him out, but I tell you, Keith Thurman better be careful, right? Because Errol has, he has took about 2 years off. His last fight was July 29th of 2023. As of today, it is August 6th of 2025, right? So Errol has took time off. He has took time to allow his body and his mind to heal, right? Some people may say that, he may be embarrassed from the Crawford loss, and that may be true. But at the same time, with him giving himself time to heal, giving his body time to heal, because Errol came right back from that car accident, if you think about it. So him taking a 2-year layoff, I would believe that he should come back to a tune-up, but knowing Errol Spence Jr., he would say that, he doesn't believe in tune-ups. And that's his priority, but I do believe that he would need a tune-up before he goes and takes an extremely tough fight like a Sebastian Findora. And I do believe that Keith Thurman would be a great fight for him, because Keith Thurman has been pretty inactive. Errol Spence has been pretty inactive, right? Errol Spence just came off a loss. Keith Thurman has not been looking. He's been looking great as far as his footwork and his ring IQ in his last 2 fights. But, his last fight was with Jarvis, whatever that dude's name is. And, he fought Mario Barrios. But Pac-Man just had a great fight with Mario Barrios. So, I say all that to say Keith Thurman doesn't look like somebody who Errol Spence can't beat. And the thing is, Errol Spence left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, right? He did not look good against Terrence Crawford. Now everybody is thinking that Errol Spence is not an elite fighter. But you have to, Errol Spence, he took the belt off of 3 men before he took that loss to Terrence Crawford. Right, so it says, of course I signed a contract. Of course, man. See, the thing about Keith Thurman, look at the resume. You think that I wanted to fight that Bondi Beach boy? Of course, he's talking about Jarvis. You think I picked that fight? They gave me that fight. Let me ask the world right here, right now. Who wants to fight Keith Thurman? Don't be scared. Say it loud. Say it proud. So Keith Thurman has always been great at selling fights. He does have a great mouthpiece on him. You know, pause. But when it comes to selling himself and being able to sell a fight, Keith Thurman is good at that. I cannot take that from him. All right, so says Spence and Thurman came very close to doing battle several years ago when the Truth was ordered to defend his WBC World Welterweight title against his countryman in November of 2022, though talks failed. I wouldn't necessarily say they failed. I would say Spence had already said, well, it says right here, Spence said he would never give Thurman a shot as he wasn't granted 1 year prior when the shoe was on the other foot. Right, and that's the point that I was making in the beginning of the video. Keith Thurman, when he was the man at welterweight, he would not fight Errol Spence because on Errol Spence's, on his come up, right, on his rise in the welterweight division, on his ascension in the welterweight division, Errol Spence did look like a man who was unstoppable, right? And I mean, all the way up until that Terrence Bud Crawford loss, Errol Spence looked unstoppable. And even with that loss to Yordenis Ugas, I mean, that win over Yordenis Ugas, I will say, you know, he did stop him, but looking back at that fight, Errol Spence did take a lot of punches, right? And a lot of his bad habits, they did show in that fight against Ugas and Terrence Crawford. He was able to take advantage of those. But even still, just the way that he was able to overcome adversity, overcome the fact that he was in that car accident. And he did have another accident, I believe, at the beginning of 2023 when I think he said a teenager ran a red light or something and he hit him. Errol Spence got hit while he was in his truck or something like that. He said he was in a bulletproof truck. But point is, the way that Errol Spence was able to overcome that car accident and be able to come back and defeat, you know, Danny Garcia and the Yordenis Ugas, it was inspiring, right? So you can see why Errol Spence's fan base still loves him and they still admire and cherish him, even though he got beat up by Terrence Crawford the way he did. All right, so it says the 36-year-old from Florida stopped Australia's Brock Jarvis in the third round of their clash in Sydney. As for Spence, he has teased the comeback and certainly looks good in shape. However, nothing solid has been revealed or reported. Yeah, so if you follow Errol the True Spence Jr. on social media, he has been looking pretty good as far as looking lean, you know, showing that he's still working out. Errol did have the tendency to blow up between fights. And that's another thing, right? I mean, you may say that he was injured, he was compromised, something was wrong with him against Terrence Bud Crawford, but in the years and build up to their fight, no one can deny that Terrence Bud Crawford has been more disciplined to his craft than Errol Spence. So it is what it is. But point is, I just find it pretty ironic that now, since Errol Spence has been inactive for about 2 years, and since the last time we saw him in the ring, he took a bad loss to Terrence Bud Crawford. Now Keith Thurman wants to call him out. But with that being said, brothers, that's pretty much it. That's all that real and rare analysis. Yo.